Welcome to the Qessa Podcast. Today we have the pleasure of speaking to Helena Zeweri, who is an African-American and an assistant professor of anthropology from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver of Canada. She is a social scientist who focuses on applied qualitative methods and community-engaged research. Helena is deeply involved in policy analysis and advocacy for migrant and minority communities across various regions, including the US, Middle East, South Asia, and Australia. Her research interests spanning refugee resettlement, social integration policies, humanitarian efforts, forced migration, and migrant political activism. Let's dive in and explore her fascinating journey and insights. This is Qessa Podcast. To support it, follow us across YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast platforms. Helena John, thank you so much for coming to Qessa Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's good that we had a bit of a conversation already before the podcast started, so to get us into that mindset of having a discourse, I guess. A lot of our audience are Farsi and Dari speakers, and we normally do this in Dari or Farsi, but for the benefit of today's conversation, and given your research and given the fact that you were born and raised in the US, you might just stick with English. What do you think?
Thank you. I appreciate so accommodating.
No worries at all. Helena John, I understand you live in Vancouver, Canada. Maybe talk about what brings you to Melbourne, Australia.
Sure, absolutely. Yes. So I'm a professor of cultural anthropology at the University of British Columbia. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've been spending time in Melbourne over the last year conducting research on the experiences of refugee rights advocates in the Afghan diaspora in Australia. I used to live in Melbourne for about a year, 2016 to 2017. And during that period, I conducted research for my dissertation on the family violence prevention system in the state of Victoria specifically. So I'm here in Melbourne conducting ethnographic research, doing a lot of interviews with people in the Afghan community who are outspoken refugee rights advocates, and I'm happy to share more about the specifics of that research, but I consider Melbourne almost like a second home at this point because not only because it's such a wonderful city, and the suburbs as well, but also because the people that I've encountered in the community and beyond have been so welcoming and open and just incredibly generous with their time and energy. And so much of the work that they're doing is just so inspiring to me, not only as an academic and researcher, but also just as a person who cares about migrants and refugee communities.
That's good to hear as someone from Melbourne. Yeah, we'll take that as a compliment. I understand that you've lived in the US, now in Canada, and have been in Australia before too. How do you think these countries compare? Which one is your most favorite?
Oh, I don't think I can answer that question without getting pushback from some person somewhere.
Okay.
But it is actually very interesting to have spent time or long periods of time in all three countries that have this shared history of being in the British Commonwealth.
Yeah.
You see a lot of shared culture and sort of political and legal structures, but there are also really important differences.
Yeah.
When I first came to Australia as a PhD student, having grown up in the United States, I was really disoriented by a lot of things. One of the things that really stood out to me was the extent to which, the federal government here has a lot of power in shaping social services, shaping the sort of everyday lives of its citizens. Whereas in the United States, it's a bit of a more decentralized system. Like, for example, individual states have a lot of power over what happens to people. And it is just really different culturally. The United States was formed as a kind of as a society that sought to break away from the British monarchy, whereas Australia and Canada, even though they're independent countries, have maintained cultural and also to some extent political ties with Britain. So that's also shaped the experiences in all three places.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, for sure. In terms of the research you've done, so if we can dive into that a little bit, I understand that there's a research you're conducting at the moment, but you've also did your PhD in Australia also, and some of the field work that you did was on the, I guess, assimilation or integration of the Muslim communities within the wider Australian society. If I understand that right, maybe if you can share some of your insights from your PhD research, and then we can slowly come to the work that you currently do.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So my PhD research was looking at family violence prevention system in Victoria, and specifically a social policy that was created around preventing forced marriage. So in 2013, the Australian government passed a law making forced marriage a federal crime. So I was really interested in understanding how this kind of law and policy was implemented on the ground. So by social service workers, by policymakers, by educators. It was very much an anthropological study. So not only looking at the policy on paper, but also looking at what happens when people are asked to implement this policy, and how does it affect immigrant communities, Muslim immigrant communities in particular. The reason I focused on Muslim immigrant communities is because this law and the policy around it disproportionately targeted those communities. And what I came to discover in my research is that even though on paper and in official kind of discourse, the problem of forced marriage was not tied to a specific community, in practice, it ended up being associated with Muslim immigrant communities. And what I did in my research was I analyzed the prevention system, but I also offer a critique of that approach and say that, a policy that is very much designed and intended to care and empower communities can quickly go into the realm of criminalizing them and painting them out to be these sort of backward people that need the intervention of the state, even if it doesn't mean to do that. And so that is what the larger study was looking at. And there are a lot of other things I can say about it, but it was also very interesting to study this in Australia, a place where the state actually has a history of itself regulating the marital practices of Indigenous communities. Right, so this whole notion of
a bit of an irony there.
Right, exactly. Yeah. This whole notion of forced marriage doesn't begin, with the increase of immigrants and refugees to Australia. The state has also had its own version of forcing and prohibiting certain kinds of marriages in Indigenous communities. So it was a very interesting place to study this policy.
Right. For me, that's a really interesting finding. Those are interesting findings from your research, though we haven't really dived deep enough in it for me to have a good understanding of it, because I worked as an interpreter for a lot of service providers that worked with families, migrant families, Afghan Australians or Hazaras that live, within the southeastern suburbs around these areas. And at times we would I would work with psychologists, community service providers, mental health service providers, even violence intervention service providers. And at times I felt like there was a lot of stereotypes from these practitioners, whether that was to do with a particular policy or it's just lack of information or lack of context. The reason those practitioners are very much, not all, but a lot of them were very much unaware of the social, this cultural context. Do you think it comes from a lack of awareness at the top level, and then that flows through to the practitioners?
Actually, it's an interesting point you make. So, according to my findings, a lot of social service workers, caseworkers, had really good intentions going into this policy in terms of prevention education. And oftentimes, they were just sort of presenting material that was given to them by the top, by the federal government. For example, there's a forced marriage, toolkit that the government presented to practitioners. And, many of them would use that as a kind of set of guidelines that they would then present to schools and migrant communities, right? But these guidelines, right, if you really analyze them, you start to see that they have embedded within them a lot of cultural stereotypes and tropes. So then the question becomes, where do those stereotypes and tropes come from? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I argue in my book is that the emergence of culturally and linguistically diverse services in social welfare, while its original aim was to provide holistic and comprehensive and culturally sensitive services to immigrants and refugees, specifically immigrant and refugee women, over time, it kind of got reappropriated by policymakers and legislators, and culture became used as a way to essentialize migrants and refugees. And what ends up happening is that the problems that refugee and immigrant communities confront are then ascribed to culture. Mm-hmm. It becomes known and defined as a cultural issue. And the way that culture is defined, everyone has a different definition of culture, but the way culture tends to be defined in these policy spaces is a static set of rituals, traditions, and beliefs, right, that don't change, that it's natural and intrinsic to people, right, as opposed to something that is more fluid, that changes over time, that changes as a result of people's lived experiences. Yep. And so what I try to point out in my research is that, ironically, again, it's the emergence of culturally and linguistically diverse services where you start to see the association of certain immigrant communities with certain forms of violence, in this case, gender-based violence. Now, that's not to say that culturally inclusive services have not greatly benefited immigrant and refugee communities. In fact, when the term CALD, which is the acronym here in Australia, when the term...
Or CALD is probably the Australian way of pronouncing it.
Right. I know my American accent just is coming out. When that term was first introduced in 1999, actually, It was meant to be a way to explain the different experiences of ethnic minorities in the country. It was a way to understand their lived experiences of not only migration, but also resettlement better. So it was a very intersectional approach, like this idea that the challenges people face are shaped by their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, their immigration status, their class status, their access to social, cultural, and economic capital. Like all these things shape people's experiences. That is an intersectional framework. And CALD as a category emerged with that mindset in mind. And a lot of the first organizations that formed in Victoria designed to help immigrants used that notion of CALD, like the Multicultural Center Against Family Violence, right? The Victorian Immigrant and Refugee Women's Coalition. They had a very intersectional perspective. But unfortunately, over time, that term has become used as a kind of catch-all phrase to sort of lump all immigrant groups together as having, one kind of experience. And then what it ends up doing is it ends up explaining, again, issues around violence, gender-based violence, family violence, as a cultural issue, as opposed to understanding it from a more structural perspective, like what is the role of displacement and war and the economic challenges of resettlement? How does that affect family violence? How does that shape interpersonal relations, in a community? So that's what I try and put forth in my book, is to not get rid of culture as a way of understanding things, but maybe open up how we define it and think about it from a more structural perspective.
And in terms of the diversity amongst the cult communities, right? Do you think that is something that is recognized in the approach, within the policies or not? Is it just a sort of one brush that they paint everyone with, or anyone that is a migrant here comes under that cult umbrella, and everyone is pretty much looked at the same way?
No, not across the board. I think it just depends on what level of society you're looking at. I think that broad brush approach has tended to happen in the creation of certain kinds of laws, like the law I mentioned before. You do see it, at times in the social welfare space. But it's interesting, amongst the practitioners that I had, the privilege of interacting with, many of them were very adamant that, this issue of family violence, for example, you can't associate it with one particular community, that it's something that cuts across Australian society, no matter what the ethnicity, even in white Anglophone Australian communities, right? So they were very much acknowledging that as a reality. But on the other hand, they were also part of a system that required them to use this language and to use these frameworks in prevention education. So that is what an anthropological perspective kind of shows you, that even when people have the best of intentions and they have the most nuanced outlooks on these issues, they can still find themselves, perpetuating language and frameworks that maybe they themselves personally do not subscribe to. Yeah.
So what's the title of the book again?
Yes, it's called Between Care and Criminality.
Yeah. How can people get it?
Yeah, it's sorry, it's a really long title. It's one of those academic titles, but it's Between Care and Criminality, Marriage, Citizenship and Family in Australian Social Welfare, and it's published by Rutgers University Press. And if you go to the press's website, Rutgers Press, I believe you can order it online.
Yeah, cool.
I hope it can. I hope it ships to Australia. That might be.
We'll look into that and then put a link in the description as well.
Thank you so much
for our audience. So that's amazing and very eye-opening for me also, because as someone that lives within this society and has had somewhat exposure through my previous work, oftentimes, I think that there's not much research or work being done in this space at all. But to see people like yourselves have actually done the research and done a lot of hard work. It's amazing. In terms of promoting that, or in a way for that to influence the policies in Australia, is there any work you're doing in that space, or I guess is that an area you're looking for help, or how does that look at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm not directly involved in policy conversations with that particular issue in Australia. At the end of the book, I do dedicate a section offering suggestions and food for thought for practitioners in the sector who work on the issue of forced marriage and family violence prevention. I offer these suggestions with utmost humility, with the knowledge that I am not a caseworker, I am not a practitioner, I am an outsider cultural anthropologist, looking at things from the outside in, and I bring my own biases also as an American who has a certain, understanding of how social services, work. And so I offer suggestions, but I also offer the caveat that, it's very difficult for people who work in social welfare to even take the time to consider these things because they are so pressed for time. These are people, and I'm sure you have a sense of this as well through your own work. You're dealing with so many intense and sometimes traumatic stories and issues, and sometimes you're overloaded with case files and clients, and you just sometimes don't have the space or time to think about the deeper implications of the work and the system that you are a part of. So what I say in the book is that for those people who have the time and who have the space and the luxury to even think about these things, these are some suggestions that we could consider.
Yeah, I really do hope that does get to, to be utilized in whether that's policies or procedures, or even for context for some of the practitioners. If, let's say, you're a practitioner working in that area, having read something like that, I'm sure it's going to make a world of difference in terms of your understanding of a particular family that might come from a from a different background. And if you don't have that understanding or that knowledge, I think the research or books like this would surely help. In terms of your journey into anthropology, how did that all begin? Like, what inspired you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I could trace it back to my graduate studies, but I think it goes back way further than that. I actually think that my family members were the first people who taught me to think like an anthropologist. In academia, when you cite your sources, you cite theorists and people in your field and literature, but I wish sometimes that you could cite your family members as inspiring, the ideas that that gave rise to your thinking. So I grew up in an Afghan community in the United States. My parents, my family are from Afghanistan. They came during the Soviet-Afghan War in the early 80s. And I just remember growing up in a family that was very empathetic, that tried to understand, individual people's lived experiences through a lens that was not black and white, through a lens that was very kind of gray, and just really tried to understand, all of the different factors that made people who they were, and that's exactly what cultural anthropologists do. Yep. So I think from a young age, I always had that sensibility. I guess it was ingrained in me to some extent. And then when I went to university, when I was doing my bachelor's, I studied international relations and political science.
Which university?
Columbia University in New York. And it was, I mean, it was enjoyable, but I think international relations didn't resonate with me by the end of it. The reason being that it didn't center the actual experiences of individuals. It was very much taking, at least the way I was taught it. I'm sure there's many different ways to think about international relations. But at least the way I was taught it, it was very much taking a zoomed out perspective on things. Like, this is how nation states interact with each other.
Yeah.
This is geopolitics. This is how the international system works. And for me, it just didn't resonate because I was always interested in, well, what about the actual people themselves? Like, how are they experiencing these systems? You know, what do they think about all this? It almost seemed like the people were taken out of the equation. Now, I know international relations is not all like this. There's different branches of it now that do look at those things. But that's kind of what led me to anthropology. It was a failed attempt at pursuing international relations. And yeah, I took a cultural anthropology class actually on women and gender in Islam. Yeah. So around like 2000, the year was like 2007. Yeah. Like revealing my age. But it resonated with me so much, and we would read these studies of like different societies in the Muslim world and how they thought about women's choices, how they thought about feminism, how they thought about gender, you know, and even just the question of like, what does it mean to make a choice? What does it mean to be an autonomous person? These are things that are understood slightly differently in different parts of the world for a number of reasons. And that really resonated with me because even though I grew up in the United States as a second generation Afghan American, the child of Afghan immigrants, you know, there was also that experience of feeling excluded and not quite fitting in, not quite belonging, not quite being understood by mainstream society. And so cultural anthropology was kind of this discipline where you felt like all ways of life could, if not be appreciated, at least be validated as like worthy of being understood. Yeah. And that really resonated with me. So that's kind of why I decided to pursue it.
Interesting journey. And from there, I understand that at the moment you are an assistant professor of anthropology at the British University of Columbia. So do you see yourself sort of, now you've found your foot, and do you see yourself in this for a while?
I think so, but I mean, I love teaching cultural anthropology to my students. I always tell my first year students specifically, I tell them, I'm not here to train you to be an anthropologist. I just want you to learn how to think anthropologically about the world. And that means how to be more empathetic toward people's experiences, how to understand why people do what they do without judging them, right? I think that's at the heart of cultural anthropology. And I think students really value that. So, I hope to continue it. But I also try and integrate other kinds of methods and research into my work.
If you tie this into some of the work that you currently do, you know, on the refugee resettlement and integration policies over the last 2 decades or so. Maybe provide some context into this.
Yeah, sure. So when I was doing my dissertation research in 2016, 2017, I noticed there was a lot of protests happening in Melbourne, like outside the state library every weekend. Like there usually are protests about something. But there were a lot of protests happening around offshore detention. People were speaking out saying we need to close offshore detention. So that got me really curious, like what was going on. So I researched a bit more into the issue, and I became really interested in learning more about these policies. Maybe from someone living in Australia, it's very obvious that this was happening, but for a large portion of the world, these policies were happening under the radar. Like it was not being reported. in American media, and a lot of Americans are still ignorant about the fact that offshore detention was a thing that happens and continues to happen.
So lack of awareness.
Lack of awareness, yeah. So that's to explain my own initial sort of ignorance about it. So I got really interested in it, and I sort of put that research or that interest to the side to finish up my dissertation. But then I started to revisit it, and I was also really interested in understanding the Afghan diasporic experience with this policy. Having grown up in the United States, in the Afghan community, the experiences of Afghans in Australia, it was kind of hinted at, talked about in passing by people in my community, but we never really understood, what people who ended up being resettled there, even in the early 80s, were going through. So Australia had always kind of been in the back of my mind as a place, another place to understand the Afghan diasporic experience. And so that's kind of what brought me to this project, is trying to understand this experience in Australia, but specifically with refugee rights advocacy. I've just been really inspired and increasingly interested in how the community here has been so outspoken and vocal about the importance of refugee rights, about the importance of changing immigration policies, whether it's around bridging visas, temporary visas, or offshore detention. It's a very different landscape than the diaspora in the United States. I mean, they're politically and culturally active in their own ways, but I think the level of kind of outspokenness and community visibility here was very interesting to me, and again, something that not many North American audiences know about, so that's why I wanted to get a better sense of it. And the other thing that drew my attention here is because in so much literature on refugees and migrants, in the academic literature, they are painted as these passive victims, these people who have had these terrible things happen to them, and that's the only way we can explain their experiences. We don't ever look at how they resist these things, how they speak back, and how they are incredibly conscious of the systems that oppress them. And that's what also drew me to this project, was how do we center the experiences of people who are speaking back, who are saying this is not fair, this is not just, as opposed to only focusing on stories of suffering and trauma. I mean, those stories are incredibly important to center, and you need those stories. But I think you also need those stories of resistance, of speaking back, and to show that, the refugee identity is not this like existential thing that people just are. It's something that happens to people, but it doesn't define their whole humanity. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, in addition to being a refugee, they're also, they're a human being, and, they've got a whole other identity there too. And then, like you just mentioned before, is around the shaping of culture and identity. It evolves, right? It's an evolving thing. And once you are in completely different society, exposed to a completely different culture and way of life, you change as a person over time, and then your reaction to what you may have gone through in that process of coming to, let's say, Australia as a refugee also evolves and changes over time, right? So you reflect back on what you went through and how that shaped who you are, and some of those or even the trauma that you had to go through as a result of the that whole process. Now, so with your current research, so are you sort of mainly focused with refugee advocates, or also some of the people that have gone through these refugee processes in Australia?
I mean, you know this, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything that the
course.
community doesn't already know, but
a lot of those refugees are advocates themselves.
Themselves, right? Yeah. And that's the thing that is also of interest from a kind of social science, sociological perspective, is especially in Australia. It's a place where newly arrived refugees are plugged in to this system of refugee resettlement, and by extension, a system that connects them to community leadership positions, cultural liaison positions, and so the visibility, right, is a community can kind of make itself visible fairly quickly, again, compared to what I've seen in the United States, where the refugee resettlement system is very limited in the resources it gives refugees, at least from the federal government, and the visibility that refugees have in public life, like in political discussions or in policy discussions. It takes a really, really, really long time for that to happen. So I think that is what makes the Australian context somewhat unique from my perspective, again, as someone who is from the United States. And then on the other hand, you have people who have become advocates, but who themselves or their loved ones have experienced the brutality and cruelty of this deterrence-based border regime, of these deterrence-based immigration policies that essentially treat asylum seekers who come by boat as criminals, as security threats, right? And then enact these really cruel and violent policies on them, whether it's offshore detention, whether it's prolonged legal limbo through these bridging visas. So that kind of contradiction or paradox is something that I think needs to be studied. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to have this visibility as a community, but then you also have to still reckon with the cruelty of these policies, and how much social change, is possible in that kind of landscape, and what are the dilemmas that people face in doing that.
Yeah.
I think learning about like your story, for example, is a really interesting lens into that.
حامی اولی برنامه پادکست قصه شما بیننده و شنونده عزیز هستین. در لابلای از او پادکست امروزی از ما را کسته صرافی آزگان یا آزگان اکسچنج مقیم استرالیا اسپانسر شدن. ما وقتی که پول و همکارای ما در برنامه پادکست قصه میخوایم پول به فامیلا پاکستان، افغانستان و یا دوبای کسته رای کنیم، از صرافی آزگان استفاده کنیم. خدمات آزگان قانونی است، سریع است و مطمئن است. یک از خوبیایی که صرافی آزگان در مقایسه با دیگه صرافی ها در اینجا است که چقدر سریع کار اجرا میشه و پول شما تحویل میده. بخصوص در کشور مثل ایران اونجا محدودیت های حساب بانکی وجود داره، یک 2 روزی 3 روزی وقت میگیره تا دیگه صرافی ها پول شما تحویل بده در ایران. اما صرافی آزگان پول شما را در بین یک چند ساعت، 1-2 ساعت کسته اما روز به روز میتونه در ایران تحویل بده. و خوبی دیگه صرافی آزگان است که تمام از این خدمات کسی میتونه از طریق تماس تلفنی انجام شونه. اصلا لازم نیست که ما با دکان ازنا بریم.
Someone that has done all the research, but which part of the work that you've done overall do you think has been the most rewarding to you personally?
Yeah. I mean, doing this research over the past year, and it's ongoing, I think that's been really rewarding because I've gotten to meet advocates in the community who are doing incredible work in the face of really challenging circumstances, both with their own personal kind of experiences of trauma, but also in a policy and like political landscape that sometimes can be hostile to what they have to say, can be hostile to their calls for reform. So the fact that they keep on going and keep on pushing for like an increase in humanitarian visas, or a shift in policies around, different visa categories, like this just shows the commitment that people have to not only a better future for themselves individually, but for their communities. Like, I think that community sort of ethos is very inspiring. Another inspiring thing has been the campaigns to forge solidarity with indigenous communities here that many Afghan Hazara refugee community leaders have undertaken. I think that's incredible, because to be able to kind of be conscious of your place in a settler colonial society that was built on the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples, and to try to find a shared experience with from your experience and their experience it's really important to combat like collective oppression. So those are inspiring. The other inspiring things, or the things that inspire me, are my work with a group called the African American Artists and Writers Association. And we've been doing a lot of things, but we started out by trying to counter representations of Afghans in the media, like misrepresentations of Afghans. A lot of us were very critical of the U.S. NATO-led intervention in Afghanistan, or how it was being conducted. We spoke out about it, and we've been doing a lot of advocacy in recent years around recently arrived migrants and people displaced as a result of the 2021 U.S. NATO withdrawal and reemergence of the Taliban regime. So
massive community of Afghans now, and ever growing at the moment as well. As an African American, as a second generation migrant in the U.S., as an anthropologist who's done a whole lot of research in so many different aspects, as we spoke, and as someone that has been observing different communities migrating both to the U.S., right, studying some of those communities, Australia, and now also living in Canada, is there a particular group of migrants that you think have done well in terms of their, and then again, this word integration, assimilation, I know is sometimes, not everybody agrees with that, because, there's some argue that it goes against, pluralism or multiculturalism and all that. But for the benefit of this conversation, if we say, okay, integration within the wider society, is there one group of migrants that you think of done well, and if so, as Afghan Australians or Hazara Australians or communities in Australia that originate from Afghanistan, what can they learn from that, and is there sort of any insight you can share on that?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Just because I prefer not to kind of rank which group has more effectively integrated over another. I would say that I would probably question, or maybe take a more critical lens into how we even define what counts as successful integration. Like, what does it mean for a group to be successfully integrated? I think there's a lot of debates around that. Does it mean that they achieve a higher income bracket as a group in a particular country? Does it mean that they adopt Western, in this case, Western cultural traditions more easily? Does it mean that they, change the way that they think about certain things like gender, or, the list could go on and on, right? So how do we measure successful integration? I think that's an open question. I think, again, integration here looks very different than integration of migrant communities in the United States, or like what the model for integration is, right? Because here in Australia, multiculturalism is institutionalized in social policy. Like, it is a basis for how social policy is created. That means that even though you're integrated here, your sort of visibility as a community, like your cultural sort of practices, so to speak, have some kind of public visibility. Yep. And it's kind of built into the system, which has it's a double-edged sword, right? Because that can easily fall into certain tropes and stereotyping and essentialisms. But it can also give a community visibility, which can be really important to mobilize politically and to get things done, like to ask the government for help with changing policy, right? So that's how it kind of plays out here. In the United States, though, multiculturalism, even though it's a term we use, it's not really built in as the foundation of social policy. So it's very much this pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that refugees confront. It's less about how do we make this community how do we even preserve, this sort of community structure and this sense of belonging, and more about, how do you get people employed? How do you get them a basic income? Like the economic precarity that refugees face in the United States is really pronounced. Not that it's not here. There's a lot of economic precarity here as well. But in the U.S., which is such a hyper-capitalist society, there isn't much room to kind of do these other things that facilitate community belonging and political mobilization. And so that is a very long-winded way of not answering your question and saying that I think integration just looks really different in different places. So it's hard to know who's more integrated than whom. Yeah.
And every community have their unique experiences anyways, and the migration happens at a different time anyway. So I think what may have assisted one group of people in, so certain initiatives or things they did in integrating or doing well, even if you do introduce a standard, say, okay, this is the standard we're going to assess, it might be different because the time changes, right? Times change, it's a whole lot of different experiences altogether.
That's such a good point. And I will just add, if I may,
sure,
that, for example, the Afghan migrants who came to the U.S. in the late 70s, early 80s, the immigration laws in the United States were very different. They were much more open. It was a bit easier to get asylum. But for migrants who are coming now, displaced people rather, they're confronting a very different immigration system. One that has securitized immigration in the sense that it sees immigrants as security issues. That wasn't always the case, like back in the 80s. In the 90s, that's really where you see that happen in the U.S. immigration policy. So it's just, exactly, different hurdles, different challenges for different waves.
Yeah, so I think on the measure of success, for migrant groups, if you're just looking at Australia, for example, if you're looking at 1950 onwards, right? So you have the Italians that have migrated here, and then you have the Greeks, and then followed by Middle Easterns and Vietnamese, and then other groups, and more recently people from Afghanistan. Now, all of them have had different experiences throughout the course of the last 50 years or so. Some groups, when you look at, let's say, if we say financial success as a measure, right? or integration within the wider Australian society in terms of where where they are, let's say, in politics or different aspects of life, right? I'm just interested as an anthropologist, whether do you think there is anything as members of the community, Afghan Australians can do to push them towards a better future in Australia, to encourage people, whether there are certain areas that they can study or get educated in, or whether there's anything that we as a community can learn from any other groups that have migrated anywhere that would help us as a community.
I see. So I think it's hard to prescribe any one formula, but I think education is a key part of it. But it seems like from the people I've met, the community that I've met, higher education and the pursuit of higher education is a deeply held value, and people are really committed to it, which is incredible. So I think in a community that is conscious of the broader world around it can be really powerful, actually. So maybe that's one thing I would say is expanding one's global sort of mindset through education. Like for me as an anthropologist, but also as someone who has done a bit of advocacy as well, I really believe in the power of global solidarity, in the power of connecting with people who have had similar, if not the exact same, experiences as you, in terms of marginalization, in terms of structural, inequality, and I believe that it benefits really any community that has had a history of marginalization to learn about the struggles and histories of other communities in the world. For example, in Australia, there's a rich tradition of Indigenous communities, learning about and exchanging with Black American communities around this issue of structural racism. And there are these global, connections and exchanges between the two groups that have formed the basis of political transformation around race, around equality. There's so many other examples of this, throughout the world. So I think that, with any Afghan diasporic community in the world, just learning about other people's struggles and experiences of, let's say, borders, of immigration, of these injustices, I think that can only form the basis for powerful political change. But at the same time, I understand that, individuals who have the lived experience of violence, of these border regimes, they know how these systems work, right? So I say this with a grain of sort of humility, like people know how these systems work. They have the lived experience of it. But I think that it can only enhance our collective power as a society to understand these histories in other communities as well.
How does the Afghan American experience vary from those of the Australian, Afghan Australians, I guess? Do you see any similarities in their experiences? Although you did talk about this briefly before, but do you see any differences, similarities, any things that we can perhaps learn from each other?
Yeah, so the Afghan, it really depends on the generation. First generation Afghan Americans who came in the early 1980s, late 1970s, like I said, they had a really different experience with immigration policies, asylum policies, it was a bit of more of an open door, not open door, but the policies were a bit more lax, especially in the wake of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. You also saw a dramatic change in immigration law in the 1960s, which encouraged different kinds of migration. So those who came in the late 1970s, they certainly faced their challenges, but they had somewhat easier time getting asylum than those who have come into the United States in the 2000s and mid-2010s. Yep. So that's an important difference, like between different generations of migrants. The other thing is the first generation didn't have like the public visibility and like the ability to, push for policy changes or, ask the government to, change its approach to Afghanistan in the way that the second generation has, because, social media and the digital platforms have had a massive impact on the ability of people to just exchange information, to advocate for themselves. So I remember growing up, there would be people in the community who they would make like these pamphlets and, they would circulate them to other family friends. And then we'd hope that would somehow reach, a congressperson. But these were paper, it was on paper and this kind of thing. But now just the circulation of information is so much more, is so much faster. So the second generation has been much more vocal in trying to reshape policy to a policy with the U.S. government when it comes to the intervention in Afghanistan and the 20-year presence in Afghanistan. In terms of what the Afghan-Australian community can learn from Afghan Americans, I think I would actually go back to the point I just made. In the U.S., there's a really strong tradition of intergroup solidarity, like allying with different groups in order to get a policy changed. And increasingly in the U.S., you see Afghans actually building solidarities with other immigrant communities, like the South Asian community, but also even like the Haitian American community. Haiti has a very, interesting history of colonialism and imperialism. There's a lot of shared experiences between our communities. So I think that might be something to look at. Yeah,
absolutely. I think dialogue and discourse is a good place to start, right? So I think it's one of the reasons we do Qessa is also to be able to have conversations like this, right? So which otherwise wouldn't necessarily be possible, or even if it is, it remains within a limited circle. And I think for us as a community to be able to talk about these issues, first of all, recognize that, these are like some of the gaps, this is where we can learn from others, this is where we might need to engage with other communities within the society also. So that was great. I'm sure there's a lot more that we can talk about. I do hope that we can continue these conversations in the future. Any final message to our audience for Qessa Podcast, recognizing that a lot of people might be watching this that, are not from Australia or America, US, or other Afghans around the world, really.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm increasingly realizing through my research and interactions with different people in the community is that the Afghan experience is a very global experience. And oftentimes, because of very tragic and inauspicious circumstances. But on the other hand, I think that experience affords this diaspora what can be a very empowering and beautiful attunement to the world. It's a very global people, and we understand how these systems work, including systems of oppression, but also systems of solidarity building and collective mobilization. And I think that power is something that we can continue to harness exactly through being in dialogue with each other. So I just want to thank you and Murtaza John for creating this platform and just amplifying these voices. And I'm just so grateful to people who have generously shared their stories with me, because they don't have to, and I'm not entitled to their time or energy, but they're just incredibly generous, and I could see that they're really committed to having these stories and experiences out there so that it makes a positive impact on society. So
amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I learned a whole lot. This is pretty much a free lecture for me here. So thank you so much. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.